On a still night in April 1990, a small crowd had gathered on the streets of Bendigo to witness the bizarre activities of one of the city's famous talking trams. Carrying about 40 passengers dressed in period costume, the tram took to the streets at 10 o'clock, only to be derailed, belching smoke and flames into the night. But this was no modern-day crisis in public transport, simply the reenactment of an important milestone in the history of Bendigo. The year 1990 was the centenary of the first appearance by a tram on the streets of Bendigo, an event which was marked by a 12-month calendar of events celebrating 100 years of trams in the Golden City. As with many other innovations, Bendigo was a community leader in the 1880s, boasting many amenities which were the envy of other Australian cities of the day. One thing the citizens felt was needed was a tramway. In 1887, the councils of Sandhurst, which later became known as Bendigo, and Eaglehawk held their first conference to discuss the possibility of linking the two centres by tram. The meeting debated the pros and cons of various systems: horse-drawn trams, cable trams, overhead wire electric system, battery trams, and even the conversion of horse cabs to horse-drawn trams. After much debate, it was decided the battery tram system would be used, and in October 1888, the Sandhurst and Eaglehawk Tramway Company came into being. It was not until the following year, 1889, that work began on construction of the track. 8 battery electric trams were ordered from the United Kingdom. 7 were made by the Brush Electrical Engineering Company, which had just taken over the Falcon Works at Loughborough. When the first battery cars arrived, the powerhouse in Mollison Street, designed to recharge the battery-powered trams, was not completed, but to test the tracks, horses were used to pull the tram to Eaglehawk and return. But the first true test was carried out at 10 o'clock at night on the 10th of April 1890. Perhaps the reason for the first test being carried out at night was not to alarm the local population with this new and possibly frightening electric horseless carriage. After all, the motor car was not yet to be seen on the streets of Bendigo, and the only means of transport was by foot, horse or train. That first run did not augur well for tram travel in Bendigo. The tram had not long left the depot when it was promptly derailed and had to be pushed back onto the tracks. Things ran well for a time, but just as officials of the Sandhurst and Eaglehawk Tramway Company began to relax, disaster struck. The electric motors began to arc so badly it was feared the tram would catch fire, and the test was abandoned and the tram returned to the depot. Finally, a half-hour service began on Saturday, June the 14th, 1890, from the railway station to the corner of Barnard Street, and by the end of July, trams were travelling all the way to Eaglehawk and return. Unfortunately, the era of battery-powered trams was not to be a long one. The service was plagued by constant breakdowns and the batteries continually ran flat. Horses were regularly called upon to tow the disabled trams back to the depot, much to the embarrassment of tramway officials. Finally, in September, just 3 months after the service began, the directors withdrew the first tram service between Sandhurst and Eaglehawk. The Bendigo Tramways are fortunate to have the original battery electric tram number 3 in its possession, although in a very dilapidated condition. The Brush Electrical Engineering Company, which made the first tram 100 years ago, built more than 8,000 tram cars and believe that Bendigo's car number 3 is the oldest Brush-built tram in existence today. It's the Bendigo Trust's ultimate aim to restore this car so that it can grace the streets of Bendigo once more. To assist with this restoration, BHP has recently donated a battery electric locomotive from its colliery, which will be used to power the restored 1890 tram. When completed, it will no doubt be the oldest electrically driven car operating in Australia. It wasn't until 1892 that a new company was formed and the Bendigo Tramway Company launched 5 steam trams to serve the local population. The trams enjoyed good patronage and the steam-powered trams became a regular feature of the Bendigo and Eaglehawk streetscape. The old battery-powered trams were not left idle though and were used as trailers behind the steam trams. While the steam trams enjoyed good patronage, the company was still not in a sound financial position and finally sold out to the British Insulated Wire Company, which was given rights to operate electric trams using an overhead system. In 1901, new offices and sheds were constructed in the best style of the period. Track and overhead equipment was placed in position, and after only a few minor problems, service began on the 15th of April 1903, almost 13 years to the day from the first appearance of the battery-powered trams. The first 12 electric cars were built by Duncan and Fraser of Adelaide, and a number of other cars were added to the fleet the following year. 5 double-decked umbrella cars, previously horse tram cars, joined the Bendigo trailer fleet from Ballarat and were used at peak passenger times. In 1913, 2 new trams were built by Duncan and Fraser, these being the open crossed bench type known as the summer car or toast rack. One of these can still be seen on Bendigo streets today. An Act of Victorian Parliament in 1918 established the State Electricity Commission of Victoria, which took over electric supply companies, some of which ran tramways, such as in Bendigo. The SEC embarked on an upgrading program to improve track and overhead equipment. Rolling stock was also expanded with second-hand tram cars, which were no longer required in Melbourne. During World War II, the track was extended to the present North Bendigo terminus. The war and a shortage of fuel ensured good patronage for the trams, and in the late 1940s, the famous Burnie cars were transferred from Geelong to augment the existing system and help meet passenger demand. The SEC took over the operation of the tramway system in 1934 from the Electric Supply Company. Then the tracks ran to Eaglehawk, Golden Square and Lake Waroona, which was extended to North Bendigo during the Second World War in 1942 to service the new government ordnance factory. At this stage, the total track extended 13.9 kilometres. In the following few minutes, we'll allow you to travel on an SEC tram along the 4 sections of the tram route. You'll notice the vintage cars, buildings and dress styles reflecting Bendigo as it was in the 1950s and 1960s. Starting at the Alexandra Fountain, we see the old clocks indicating the time of the next service to each of the 4 destinations. First, we travel on the Eaglehawk route that took 25 minutes each way. Returning to Charing Cross, we now travel to Quarry Hill, which took 10 minutes each way. It also took 10 minutes to travel to Golden Square. The extended track to the North Bendigo terminus also took 10 minutes. However, the boom in tram travel was short-lived, as the rising popularity of motor cars and increased running costs prompted the SEC to consider phasing out tram services. But the trams did have loyal supporters who argued that the system should never be replaced. They said the trams provided a regular, fast and reliable transport at frequent intervals for long hours, 7 days a week. While not the most comfortable way to travel, it was certainly the cheapest. While the overhead cables did clutter the city skyline, the electric power which ran the cars was considered less of a pollution hazard than the alternatives. Conductors and drivers were a ready source of information pointing out places of interest, helping passengers find their destinations and assisting the old, the frail and the young. They'd often hold the tram as a panting regular race to catch it. They'd help a mother on board with pram and young children and deal patiently with late-night revellers who wanted to sing or spin a yarn. In all the years that the trams offered their service to the people of Bendigo, there were many characters among the drivers and conductors. There were some who sang, others told jokes, but it was the helpful and personal service that most people remember, and why the trams and their operators were so sadly mourned when the service finally came to an end in April 1972. On that day, the population turned out in strength for an emotional farewell. In the days leading up to the final trip, there were sentimental journeys by children and adults, both local and visitors from far afield. A group of 60 regulars from the Courthouse Hotel hired a tram for a pub crawl from the city to Eaglehawk and back. armed with baskets of pies, pasties and sausage rolls, and to the strains of 2 piano accordions, the party stopped at all the pubs on the left on the way out and the other side on the return journey. One elderly lady, Mrs. Peake of Epsom, who'd travelled on one of the first electric trams in Bendigo when she was a student at Gravel Hill School in 1903, went for her last trip 69 years later, on the same day that the trams stopped. At 6 o'clock on Sunday, April the 16th, 1972, the last tram turned off Macrae Street, accompanied by a hooting motorcade and thousands of onlookers and the Bendigo Highland Pipe Band. The SEC era was over, but a new era had already begun under the auspices of the newly formed Bendigo Trust, established to preserve the trams and other local heritage. The battle to save the trams falling into outside hands intensified immediately after the last tram was piped into the Macrae Street depot. The SEC announced it had 123 offers to buy Bendigo's trams from various parts of Australia and overseas. There were only 23 trams in the fleet, and the Bendigo Trust was determined to keep them all. It pointed out that if it were to retain the whole fleet, and in particular the rare Burnie cars, Bendigo would have a tramway which was unique in the world. An army of volunteers, members of the Bendigo Trust and other community residents pledged their support for the campaign with fundraising activities, petitions and working bees. Without their involvement, the fleet would certainly have been broken up and Bendigo may have retained a single tram on a concrete plinth in some forgotten corner of the city. The fight to save the fleet made national headlines in October 1972 when the Adelaide-based Australian Electric Transport Company decided to claim one of the Burnie cars promised to it by the SEC. One night in October 1972, members of the Adelaide group attempted to collect the tram themselves, but their efforts were thwarted when the Bendigo group welded the tram concern to the rails, making removal impossible. Hundreds of Bendigo people rallied to an appeal by the Mayor to defend the trams, and the interstaters were forced to return home without their tram. Finally, on Saturday, December the 9th, 1972, only 8 months after the last SEC tram completed a journey on the Bendigo tracks, the then Victorian Premier, Mr Hamer, launched Tram number 30 and thus commenced the Bendigo Vintage Talking Tram Tours. The new tourist tramway began initially with 4 cars and the service was to run on weekends and public holidays with special services during school holidays. It was an immediate success and within the first few months more than 6,000 passengers were carried. Over the years, the Bendigo Trust has continued with its aim to restore the entire working fleet, with a result that now 20 of the original 23 are available for service. A feature of the new tourist service is the excellent taped commentary that is now an integral part of the Talking Tram Tour. Interesting characters and areas are described and the historic buildings and precincts are pointed out as the trams pass through the heart of Bendigo. The Bendigo Tramways has grown considerably and now employs a number of full-time and part-time staff to manage its operations. An army of men, women and children have helped plant trees, pave the terminus, maintain the tracks, work on overhead wiring, fitting indicators and stoplights, painting and polishing the trams, installing sound systems, relaying the track and generally keeping the Bendigo Tramways fully functional and continuing its development. In its first 10 years of operation as a tourist tram venture, the Bendigo Trust carried 350,000 passengers. Number 750,000 purchased a ticket in March 1989. During that time, the trams have carried everyone from Prime Ministers to future kings. The most notable passengers and drivers include Prince Charles, Prime Minister Hawke, a host of Victorian premiers and the Governor of Victoria, Dr Davis McCaughey. Over the years, there have been some amazing scenes involving the famous Bendigo talking trams. They've been pushed by people, pulled by horses and tractors, and even a team of huskies. They've hosted just about every celebration imaginable. People have been married on Bendigo trams. They've celebrated birthdays and even made guest appearances at Melbourne festivals. Throughout the years, the quest has continued to find and restore the grand old ladies of the past. Over the years, the Bendigo Trust has restored some 17 trams. Currently, the Bendigo Tramways fleet comprise some 30 trams, although not all are fully serviceable. Amongst them we have ancient four-wheeled truck cars known as leaping leaners to the locals, the ever-popular summer car or toast rack, which was built specifically for Bendigo in 1913. Our bogie trams include the two motor cars, which have a unique penny farthing wheel design, and the four-motor W2 class type. Pride of our fleet are the world-famous American-built Birney cars. Bendigo has 5 of these rare trams, which is the largest group of operating Birney cars in the world today. Tram lovers can take a ride on a rare Birney car operating on its original circuit. The Birney cars were built for one-man operation in the United States during the 1920s. The famous talking trams now occupy a special place in the life of Bendigo and its community. Bendigo's love for its trams was evidenced by the turnout of thousands of people for the centenary cavalcade of trams in June 1990. Residents and visitors in their thousands converged on Pall Mall to witness the first ever cavalcade of the full fleet of Bendigo talking trams. The cavalcade marked the centenary of the official launch of Bendigo's first tram service in June 1890 and was marked with all the pomp and ceremony befitting what has become one of the great institutions of our city. A unique souvenir was issued to mark the occasion in the form of specially mounted sections of the original tram line which had been laid down in the Mollison Street depot more than 100 years ago. A special commemoration medallion was also struck to commemorate the centenary. The glorious past of Bendigo's famous talking trams is matched only by the great prospects for the future. Already the Bendigo Trust is working hard on plans for a new terminus at Violet Street, which will become the focal point for all tours. A large iron and steel terminus is proposed to allow passengers to enter and leave the trams in comfort while still protecting the architectural style of the period. Of course, there are those who doubt the wisdom of such, just as there were doubts in 1890 and again in 1972 when the Bendigo Trust took over the fleet. But the Bendigo Trust has developed a reputation for delivering the goods when the odds seem impossible. Thanks to a dedicated band of staff and volunteers, the tramway has become an integral part of life in Bendigo. There's no doubt at all that in another 100 years, the Bendigo Trust will still be there, preserving a very special part of our heritage, the grand old ladies of rail.